Good evening and welcome to Chicago Tonight, Latino Voices. I'm Joanna Hernandez. On the show tonight, Illinois lawmakers leave Chicago's elected school board in limbo.
It is very tough knowing that people still don't know what DACA means and what DACA represents.
DACA recipients push for action on federal health insurance coverage.
Latino workers are more susceptible to have accidents, deaths.
Calls for work permits for longtime undocumented immigrants.
We saw the need and we opened our doors and invited people in.
And a Ravenswood Manor Church opens its doors to migrants and says other places of worship should follow suit. And now to some of today's top stories. President Joe Biden visits Illinois. He was in Belvedere this morning, which is near Rockford, speaking with United Auto Workers and celebrating the reopening of an assembly plant that closed earlier this year. It reopened as part of a deal between the union and the company Stellantis. The contract is set to bring back thousands of jobs.
You saved the auto industry, and they should step up for you. A simple proposition. You kept the picket line going for 46 days. You kept your negotiations working round the clock, negotiators. And in the end, the deal you reached set a new standard.
After his stop in Belvedere, Biden came to Chicago for private fundraising events as part of his re-election efforts. A hotel on the Mag Mile is set to become a homeless shelter. In a statement today, Mayor Brandon Johnson says the city will temporarily use the Selena Hotel as a homeless shelter this winter. Johnson adds the property will not be used to house asylum seekers. Workers at the hotel say they've been laid off as a result of the move. Johnson says the shelter will be funded by an emergency and transitional housing grant. The historical trial of former Alderman Ed Burke that began Monday is now on hold, at least for a week. It comes after an attorney in the case tested positive for COVID-19. It puts the courtroom show down further behind schedule. 3 days of jury selection moved at a snail's pace. Burke faces 14 charges of racketeering, bribery, and extortion. The trial is expected to last 6 weeks. City council members are set to vote on a measure that would give Chicago workers at least 10 days of paid time off every year. Alder people are debating the ordinance at City Hall this evening. It's a measure that's pitted labor groups and some business groups against each other. The ordinance would require employers to give workers 5 sick days and 5 days of paid time off for any reason. Chicago's former top doctor has a new job. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention announces Dr. Ardoui will join the agency. Ardoui will lead efforts across the country to help curb drug overdoses, violence, suicide, and other injuries. Ardoui served 4 years as the city's top public health official until she was fired by Mayor Brandon Johnson in August. Up next, lawmakers battle over the future of Chicago's school board. Amanda Vinicky has a story right after this.
Chicago Tonight, Latino Voices, is made possible in part by the support of these donors.
The Chicago Public School Board will be elected in the future. The questions are how and when. Chicago lawmakers are leaving those questions unresolved for the moment. Amanda Vinicky just returned from Springfield and joins us with the latest. Thank you, Amanda, for joining us. What can you tell us?
Well, so, Joanna, we are about a year away from the 2024 elections, and that is when Chicago voters will begin to elect members of the Board of Education. But there is a chance that voters will also get to elect the entire 20-person board. Now, that's if the president of the Illinois Senate and various community organizations have their way. But there's also a chance that a year from now, voters will only elect 10 members, and then the mayor would get to appoint the other half of the board, and that's how leaders in the Illinois House want it, as well as the Chicago Teachers Union.
So Amanda, so either all elected or a hybrid board. What's the reasoning for starting out with the half elected, half appointed Board of Education?
Well, that had been the plan from 2021 when the elected school board bill was signed into law, and the idea there is to phase in such a monumental change.
Starting a new school board for a district as big as Chicago is quite an endeavor. It's going to bring with it several complexities. It's challenging to start from scratch a new entity.
And Amanda, what are the merits of all elected board?
Well, there is a practical component with this one as well. The legislature has struggled to figure out how to do this half and half model. And backers of that approach say that they have come up with a solution, albeit one that could get confusing. But there's also a philosophical component. Chicago, the only district in Illinois where board members are not elected, and it took decades to get a law passed to change that. The objective is to make the board more responsive and, in a word, democracy. So advocates say get to it and elect the whole board right away.
And you mentioned the CTU. How does the union fit into this?
Well, so the CTU had campaigned really hard for an elected school board, and at the time they wanted it to be all elected right away. But now the union has reversed course. The union put out a statement saying they now prefer this half-appointed board proposal because it, quote, ensures a smooth transition to a fully elected school board in 2026. Skeptics, though, suspect that the change of heart is because of who is in the mayor's office, as in the fifth floor occupied not by CTU antagonist Lori Lightfoot, but rather it's Mayor Brandon Johnson, former CTU member and organizer.
What did Johnson say, Amanda?
So actually, Joanna, I called his office this afternoon, spoke with a spokesperson who said, no comment. So not a lot there, but those associated with the mayor do bring up this notion of chaos that could come with a jump to an all-elected board right away. Again, the election 2024, and then these individuals would take seats starting in 2025.
And where does that leave things then?
So in a way, as I just noted, it's a ways off, so things are in limbo. Legislators say, don't worry about it. They had actually already skipped one deadline to get this resolved. They were supposed to have it done at the end of their spring session. Then they give themselves quite an extension. So they have really until the beginning of April to finalize this. Still, what everybody that I've been talking to said, they want to get it resolved as soon as possible so that candidates who are contemplating making a run for the board can hurry up and make those decisions, and they need to know things like where they're going to be running, how many seats will be up before they have the chance to do that. I will say that both sides say that they are hopeful they're going to reach a resolution. They may say that, but somebody is going to have to give something up in order for it to get to that point.
What about the maps of districts that have been controversial, right?
Well, yes, they had been really controversial, and actually maps are not finalized either. The legislature did not approve them because that has to be signed into law. Still, a map is pretty much set. There isn't an agreement on everything we've been talking about, but there is an agreement now on the maps. One that will have 6 districts in, it will have a majority of voting age Latinos in them. There are, however, some Latino groups that are still upset with that. They say that given that about half of CPS students are Latino or identify as such, that there should be more majority Latino districts.
Well, there's clearly a lot to talk about. Now, thank you, Amanda Vinicky, for joining us.
Thank you.
Up next, the White House misses a deadline regarding federal health insurance for DACA recipients. Stay with us. DACA recipients known as Dreamers are still waiting to qualify for federal health care insurance programs. Earlier this year, the Biden administration announced plans to expand health care coverage to those enrolled in a Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program. But the proposed change has yet to be finalized, leaving thousands of young adults who were brought to the U.S. as children in limbo. Diana Flores has lived in Chicago for most of her life. Where did you grow up here in Chicago?
I grew up in the south side of Chicago. Yeah, kind of by McKinley Park area.
Flores has celebrated birthdays, graduations, and welcomed a baby boy, all while navigating the barriers of being a DACA recipient.
It was very hard when I had found out I was pregnant. Unfortunately, I didn't have a job at that time. My husband couldn't add me to his insurance, so I had to pay out of pocket. I was $500 every 2 weeks since I was considered high risk.
The DACA program has protected thousands of young adults like Flores from deportation, but they are restricted from applying to federal health insurance programs.
I know if I'm struggling with it, there's hundreds of thousands of other people also struggling with it, and it's just not fair for us since we're also contributing to all the taxes, all the insurance.
In April, the Biden administration announced plans to extend Medicaid and the Affordable Care Act marketplace to Dreamers.
Unfortunately, November 1st has come around and the rule has not yet been implemented or finalized.
And time is ticking, says Martha Sanchez with Young Invincibles, an adult policy and advocacy organization. While DACA recipients are eligible for employer health coverage, there are still thousands of Dreamers without it.
I mean, waiting over 10 years to finally have access to the Affordable Care Act marketplace would be significant. Anyone deserves to have, which is to be able to have access to health care, preventive health especially.
Under the proposed rule change, more than 100,000 DACA recipients would be eligible for federal health care for the first time since DACA was implemented in 2012.
How much would you say that you and your husband spent that year during the pregnancy?
During the pregnancy, I want to say we spent easily like $20,000.
Flores will be able to obtain citizenship through her marriage, but hopes one day all Dreamers are able to become citizens as well.
A pathway to citizenship for sure. That should be the end goal. They're just being in limbo and not even giving us the bare minimum is not the answer.
We contacted the White House and the Department of Health and Human Services for an update on this ruling, but have not received a response. Thousands are heading to Washington, D.C. next week to demand work permits for longtime undocumented immigrants following weeks of advocacy in Chicago. The Biden administration has started granting temporary.
Since I got here, I started working. I have been paying my taxes. I have been working and tried to live by the law. But that's not enough for me to gain a status in the country. Latino workers are more susceptible to have accidents, deaths, to have abuse at work. And having this permit, that's one protection that we can do for all these workers.
This push comes as the Biden administration has started granting temporary protected status to almost 500,000 Venezuelan migrants who are already in the country, quickly making them eligible to work. Just today, the White House, the city of Chicago, and the state launched a pilot program to help migrants apply for those permits. Meanwhile, advocates are pushing for work permits for more than 180,000 undocumented immigrants in Chicago. Joining us now with more are Irene Rendon, Vice President of Immigrant Injustice with the Resurrection Project, Susan Zesch, Professor at the University of Chicago and attorney with Hughes Slocall Peers, Resdick and Dim, and Yolanda Denanda, founder of Director of Tia and Grandma, a nonprofit focused on strengthening family units located in the East Side community. Thank you all for joining us. Now let's get straight to it, Irene. Tell us about next week's march. Why the new push for this, and what are you asking for from President Biden?
Yeah, well, what we're seeing is that the president has broad authority to grant work permits through a program called Parole. He's been doing it for 2 years now for certain folks from certain countries and all for new immigrants, on top of what you mentioned, which is TPS for Venezuelans. Those are all great things for us. We believe every immigrant should be able to get a work permit, but it's very clear that the Biden administration is intentionally ignoring the undocumented community who have been here for, now an average of 20 years in the U.S. working without authorization, working under the shadows.
And we know Mexicans have made up a large population of undocumented community for decades. Susan, break it down for us. Why haven't we seen further reform?
Well, it goes back a long way, and I'm not going to give you 150 years of history, but basically the attitude of the Congress in formulating U.S. immigration law has largely been towards immigrants from Mexico that they're welcome to come here to work, but they're not so sure they want them to be future citizens. So just to go back to 1965, Congress set up the system that we have now, pretty much, that some people come because they have certain relatives who are permanent residents or citizens. Other people come because they have work needed in the economy. But that work category has never included most of the sectors in which you find a lot of immigrant workers. But from 65 to 76, you had the legalization of up to 100,000 migrants a year from the Western Hemisphere. And it wasn't limited per country. And Mexicans during that period were using 80,000 of those 100,000 slots. But then in 1976, some forces in Congress decided that they wanted to limit the number of Mexicans who could become legal and come in legally and become future citizens. So they dropped the number. They said, you know, it's not fair that countries in the Western Hemisphere could go up that high. We're going to put Mexico and the other countries in the hemisphere, which was true for countries in the Eastern Hemisphere, 20,000 maximum a year. So overnight, they transformed a flow of people that had been largely legal to a flow of people because people were still coming for the same reasons of family reunification, the economy in Mexico, things that have only intensified in the last number of years. But they changed the nature of that status from legal to illegal.
And I mean, my family was one of those families, honestly. Now, obviously, there's a lot to weigh in here that more than 20,000 migrants have arrived in Chicago since last year, the majority from Venezuela. Yolanda, what recourse would you like to see from President Biden?
Well, I'd like to see that work permit for all of them. As it was mentioned, many of them, and I've been working with the immigration since the amnesty program, and many of them, as we hear this, is that they became legal and then their family joined them. And many of them, through their brothers or sisters that became citizens, applied. And they are still waiting for that date to open up.
Is that what frustrates you the most?
Yes.
Continuing to hear the same story, you would say?
Exactly, the same story. These brothers take 21 years before they can even start the process.
Yeah.
And as long as it's happening, it is also now that if you did not have that brother that applied for you, but you now have a child that's 21 years old, you now have to ask for a waiver because you're going to go to the embassy in your country, and there is a rule that says if you've been in this country for longer than 180 days, you could be punished from 3 years to 10 years.
And it could be confusing.
Yeah.
It seems like there's always so many rules.
Yeah, so what this is about is that people who are on the waiting lists to immigrate through their relatives because of their unlawful status while they've been here, that is going to force them out of the country. So through the same parole power that the executive branch is able to exercise to bring Ukrainians, Afghans, Cubans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, Venezuelans into the country so that their entry is legal, there's also a parole in place. So if the executive branch, in other words, the White House, wanted to say, for example, that people who were on these long waiting lists could be granted parole in place, then they could also get work authorization, and then they wouldn't have to fear being deported before their number finally came up on these long lists, and their status would be regularized.
Eddie, I want to bring you in. What are your thoughts on what she's saying?
I mean, I think when you're an undocumented person, you know that the odds are set against you. My parents came in, my dad came in 1986, just missed the amnesty. My mom and my siblings and I came in 1990. I got my work permit through DACA now 12 years ago, 11 years ago. And what we know is that when immigrants are given the opportunity to apply for a work permit, they do. We just had our first work permit workshop today. 200 people applied. But unfortunately, there have been policies that have left particularly the Mexican undocumented community in this situation, and we're stuck in it. We can't adjust because we have these 10-year bars, and we really need now to make sure that the president is listening and stops ignoring particularly the Mexican undocumented community.
I know we talked about this a little bit, Yolanda, talking about the legal system. What kind of delays are people experiencing in their path to residency and citizenship?
Well, the problem is, like you said, you first you get approved by your family member who applies for you. And then you have to wait till the date is available. And right now,
and you don't know that date. How
that
long
date
could
is
that
there.
date be?
The date could be almost 20 years if through a brother, through a non-resident to take a little less. And even if you're a U.S. citizen, it still takes a lot of years. And then there's the second part. The waiver takes about 5 years to get. to
It's a
be
really long
granted.
process.
5 years. So now you've waited 21 years to continue the process, 5 years to wait for the waiver so that you don't get punished when you go to your embassy. And most of these people file their taxes to what they call a tax identification number. And I have found people that have died before they can even become a resident, and therefore their family, their files did not go into the Social Security. Yes, it's heartbreaking.
And one of the things we know, for example, is that the Social Security system as it is, and I'm 72 years old, so this is something I care about, is really being supported by money paid in by undocumented workers who are never going to get it out, to the tune of $6 to $7 billion a year. And so allowing people to recoup their what they paid into Social Security seems like a very important justice issue. Yeah.
And I have the last question for you. What are you hoping to accomplish in DC next week? Are you hopeful that the Biden administration will respond?
I think what the Biden administration is going to start looking to the polls, start understanding what's happening. We're telling him the solution to be able to make sure that he is responding to the Latino community in the U.S.
Well, thank you all for joining us. Our thanks to Eric Rendon, Susan Sesh, and Yolanda de Anda. Up next, how a local church is opening its doors to migrants. But first, a look at the weather. There are still more than 3,000 migrants living around police stations, including Chicago airports, as the city struggles with how to find temporary shelter for everyone. Mayor Brandon Johnson has called on places of worship to assist. A small church on the city's northwest side has answered that call, not only providing shelter, but following the age-old saying, give a man a fish and you feed him for a day. Teach a man a fish and you feed him for a lifetime. Paris Schutz has a story.
Each morning, a group of volunteers and migrants sheltering at Luther Memorial Church prepare meals and hot coffee to go. The group is led by church pastor Lindsay Mack and recent Venezuelan arrival Edward Piamo, who was a chef back in his home country. They deliver the food to the nearly 200 migrants sheltering in and around the 17th District Police Station on Pulaski and Leland. Piamo had to shelter here with his wife and 3 children before being taken in by the church. Now he's giving back.
Sí, es muy importante ayudarlo, más que todo ahorita que está cayendo el invierno, lo que es la taza caliente, el sándwich, la arepita, comida caliente al instante.
Piamo's family fled Venezuela last year. Their harrowing journey took them from Colombia through the dangerous Darien Gap into Panama, and then through Central America, Mexico, and finally to Laredo, Texas, where they were put on a plane to Chicago. They are now part of a group of 21 people sheltering at Luther Memorial.
Me siento en casa. De verdad me siento en casa, me siento a gusto. Tenemos a muchas personas a nuestro alrededor, en nuestro entorno, muy buenas personas.
Pastor Mack says she and church volunteers have been serving migrants living at the 17th District. 6 months ago, they decided they wanted to do more.
It was not a hard decision. We had the space. We saw the need, and we opened our doors and invited people in.
We didn't have a plan when we first started this.
Volunteer Linda Nguyen led the effort to convert a church and Sunday school facility into a shelter. Families have their own rooms and a place to congregate. The children are already enrolled at CPS's Waters Elementary, right across the street. Nguyen says the church is trying to get the families to be self-sufficient, setting daily routines and teaching them English.
They're all here because they want to live full, independent lives. They had to flee inhumane and terrible conditions, and they're here to start a life anew. And by giving these resources to them, really jumpstarts them in the right direction.
Pastor Mack says the program is possible due to the generosity of community members, donating money and supplies. With more than 3,000 migrants still in need of shelter for the winter, Mack says Luther Memorial has proven that places of worship have a big role to play.
This is part of who we are as people of faith. All of our great faith traditions tell us to be concerned about immigrants and foreigners in our land. They tell us that we were once foreigners. Welcome people into our land as you were welcomed.
A mí me gusta Chicago, de verdad me gusta.
¿Y la gente en Chicago?
Muy buena, de verdad, muy buena, sí.
Piamo says he hopes Chicagoans see migrants as an opportunity for their city rather than a burden, and says he has big dreams for his family in this country.
Como me imagino que muchos, mi proyecto es salir adelante. Quiero montar un negocio de comida rápida también o un restaurante. Ese es mi proyecto, pues.
His specialty is arepas with eggs, meat, and plantains. Judging by the taste, Piamo might just be onto something.
Muy bueno.
For Chicago Tonight Latino Voices, this is Paris Schutz.
Paris, next time you need to bring me an arepa, they're really good. Pastor Max says she believes the city should help fund places of worship that decide to shelter migrants. And that's our show tonight. Be sure to check out our website, www.ttw.com/news, for the very latest from WTTW News. And join us tomorrow night at 5:30 and 7 for the Weekend Review. Now, from all of us here at Chicago Tonight Latino Voices, I'm Joanna Hernandez. Stay healthy, stay safe. Buenas noches.
Closed captioning is made possible by Robert A. Clifford and Clifford Law Offices, a Chicago personal injury and wrongful death firm that is proud to give back to its community in Chicago and beyond.